As a Resident Evil fan, it pained me to say that I'd never played the third game. Not the original, nor the remake. But I had always wanted to, and for my whole life I avoided as many spoilers as I possibly could. I wanted Nemesis to scare me stupid. I wanted him to live up to the years of being called one of, if not the best Resident Evil monster. But not having anything unspoiled is an impossible task nowadays, especially when you spend as much time on the internet as I do. Going into this completion, I knew two things. That there was an Inferno difficulty, thanks to the innumerable challenge runs on my homepage, and more importantly, I knew that a lot of people really disliked this remake and absolutely cherished the original. Was the remake really as bad as people were saying? Especially when the remake of 2, that I played not too long ago, was so good? Was everyone simply judging this one through rose-tinted glasses? Well, kind of. But also not really. I think a lot of what I heard coming into this was the vocal minority, but it does still absolutely have its flaws. Coming in fresh as an outsider, there are a lot of things that I'm surprised aren't talked about more, and by the end of my journey through Resident Evil 3, which ended up also including my first playthrough of the original, and a bunch of research into what made that game so special, I feel like there's a lot to be said about everything from level design and atmosphere to difficulty and jank. That means I'm about to drop a lot of personal opinions that people will certainly disagree with, so if you'd like to share your experiences or thoughts in the comments, I'd love to hear them, if not just to better understand where all the strong feelings come from. And naturally, this was a full completion playthrough, so I'll be ranking it on my completion tier list by the end. With all that said, let's get started, shall we? The first decision was which difficulty to choose. Lately, I've been trying to challenge myself by starting on harder difficulties, but my experiences in Resident Evil 2 taught me the value of a good, standard playthrough, and so I decided to go with that for my first time. The opening cinematic began to play, and my heart rate began to rise. Regardless of what I expect, regardless of whatever lies I try to trick my brain into believing, or how many games I play or movies I watch, I cannot stop from getting stressed out playing these damn horror games. This one was particularly bad. Starting in Jill's apartment, I spent the first few minutes reading several notes and checking out all the little details. Then it was off to the races. This intro is insane, for a couple reasons. The thrilling destruction wrought by Nemesis, the explosions and fire, the escape down to the streets, moment to moment, it's really quite something. The first time. I'm not the biggest fan of cinematic sequences, and here, at the outset, is the game's largest one. So while it was fun to see it all now, it didn't hold up so well once it was time for subsequent playthroughs. And while most of the cinematics can be skipped, you can't skip the walking, and it's extremely linear, yellow tape to guide you and all, which you can have your own opinion about. I enjoyed it this first time though, and after Carlos snatched me from the grasp of death, I got my first achievement. I made my way up to the top of the metro for a nice chunk of free loot, and I don't know about you guys, but getting a ton of stuff all at the same time makes me nervous. Thankfully, there was also a typewriter, so I made my first save and exited the metro. The first zombie waltzed in, and I felt right at home with the gunplay. Shooting feels as good as it did in 2, and I dropped him in a few shots. I also got a few knife jabs in for good measure. This unlimited knife sure feels more practical than RE2's limited one, but I can assure you it is a lot less useful. I got to work exploring, scavenging for items, and polishing off as many enemies as I could, because the various locked doors told me I'd be back here, and I didn't want to contend with a street full of zombies if I had to get through quickly. But there were a lot of them here. Certainly more than I expected, and I quickly began to worry about my ammo reserves. I wasn't the most confident in my ability to navigate around these guys, especially if Nemesis dropped in, wherever he was, and I hadn't even touched the dodge button to figure that out yet. Just about then, I found a couple gunpowders. So while yes, there are a lot of enemies, there's also a lot of ammo. And it was a good change of pace from 2, where both were scarcer because the best part of these remakes for me is shooting zombies. That's not to mention these barrels, which were pretty useful in conserving ammo. Though, shooting it did give me a false sense of security, and I was properly jump scared for the first time by this bastard lunging out of a cop car. After dealing with him, I entered the back of the donut shop, where a stash of items in a safe room with another fantastic music theme awaited me. I also collected a fancy box with a red jewel inside that I stashed away for the time being. Back outside, I took my first hit because I kept trying to make the knife work when I shouldn't have, and found this nice shortcut back to the fire I needed to extinguish. Thinking back on it, this is probably the only shortcut in the entire game that gets used more than once. I was ambushed a couple more times, which became a bit of a theme, and was rewarded for my efforts with more items. I was kitted out by the time I finally went into the subway office. In here, I found the first of 20 Charlie dolls for another achievement, the fire hose to progress, several items, and the shotgun, which I'd need to return for. I was seriously struggling with inventory space at this point, even having a full stack of handgun bullets despite killing every enemy I'd come across so far. My mind was on Nemesis. He would inevitably show up because there was no way they'd allow me to gather up so many things without something to dump them on. Fire doused, and I found the bolt cutters right past it, so I dropped off some items and grabbed them. I opted not to return for the shotgun, because I was distracted by the clattering in the next room. Here was Nikolai, a remarkably unlikable guy.
There's your sense of self-preservation.
I wonder what role he'll play. There were several notes here, a couple expanding on the lore a tiny bit, but more importantly, one letting me know that the sparking generators were actually environmental traps I could use. There was one right ahead of me, and sure enough, there was a reason I was learning about it now. The next area was the electric substation, and man, what a fun and wholesome place this turned out to be. Yeah. On the plus side, I scored the first inventory expansion and got the lockpicks before being assaulted. But once I was in the maze, this was probably the most stressed I'd been up until this point. These little rats that drain Demos hide around corners and sprint at you from behind, popping out of questionably shaped holes in the walls and rushing you in numbers if you let them. I was so freaked out that I ended up walking right past the switches multiple times. Eventually, I think I killed enough of them to slow down and figure out what I was doing, but man, I really disliked how this whole section made me feel. I also blew through almost all of my handgun ammo, and that ended up being a bit of a problem for reasons that you can probably guess. If you couldn't, it's Nemesis.
Oh fuck, man, I did not expect you.
Right as the bugs and my shiny new lockpicks had me distracted from the big picture, Nemesis blasted through a wall and reminded me why I don't do well with horror. I shook him for a second, but back on the main street, just as predicted, more obstacles stood in my way.
Oh shit!
Nemesis was immediately back on my trail, and I was forced forward, taking some more damage and using another generator to buy myself some time to fight through the subway office once again. You better damn well believe the first thing I did was grab the shotgun from its rack. Then, the first puzzle. This was a bit confusing at first because I didn't really know what I was looking at, but after calming down and realizing the red lines on the board were closed off routes, it was as simple as marking in the ones that weren't. Later on, I realized the letters just corresponded with the street names, and in future playthroughs this was a cinch to remember. The second puzzle was trying to figure out how to kill these tentacle zombies, and after wasting a bunch of ammo and a first aid spray, I succeeded. These guys were some of the most annoying enemies in the game, and I cringed a little anytime they showed up. For now, I was doing my best to avoid them since they were now littered all over the streets while doing my best to collect what few items I still could before Nemesis found me again. Turns out I'd find him first, right outside the donut shop, doing his business like he does. I barely managed to get away long enough to unlock the toy store, where I found another gem box and Charlie doll. With some difficulty, I managed to cross the street and grab the last few items from the grocery store, which allowed me to toss the bolt cutters and make the final sprint back to the metro station. This was one of, if not the scariest parts of the whole game for me, and I was wholly glad to have it over with. Nemesis, with his ability to sprint you down and cut you off on a whim, is terrifying. He does an obscene amount of damage if you let him, and with the streets repopulated with zombies I had no time to deal with, it was that much more stressful. For better or worse, this is the only time a sequence like this happens, and I think it's a big part of why people don't respect this Nemesis like the original. It's only downhill for him from here. I think if this version of Nemesis, maybe with his iconic rocket launcher at some point, chased you across the game, it'd be better, but that'd be hard to pull off for a reason I'll get into in a little bit. Anyway, with the gems returned to their proper place here, I was rewarded with a grenade, my first gun attachment for the shotgun, an inventory upgrade, and the Power Stones achievement. I also got the gunsmith one for improving my shotgun. Thanks to Jill's antics, there was one more small section with Nemesis, and I was still too unused to his seemingly Mach speed punches. There were very obvious ways to deal with him though, and so after a quick zap, I lured him into these barrels, collected his supply case and the achievement to go with it, and crawled into the sewers. This was my least favorite part of the game, for a completely different reason than the power substation. If you'll allow me to rant for a moment, during my research, I found that this remake was made alongside the RE2 one, and I can't help but think that's why a lot of the assets are used in both games. A lot of it makes sense. Enemy models and items, of course, but even the RPD since that's staying true to the original. But knowing what I know now, and looking back, I have to wonder if the sewers are only present because they had those assets available. There were sewer-adjacent areas in the original, sure, but not an entire section like we have here, where the entire level is more or less one long hallway to run back and forth through. The worst part, though, is the enemy choice. These are the Hunter Gammas, and they are the only enemy here. So basically, you start at the door you need to end at, go down a path you can't crawl back up from, pick up a bunch of items including the grenade launcher, of which the flame rounds just so happen to be the weakness of these creatures, and the battery pack key item, run back to the start to unlock the door, and you're done. All while killing 5 or 6 of these big boys and nothing else. Now, on the first playthrough, it's not so bad. It's tense because of the impending threats you're not aware won't show up. It's plenty atmospheric, and the gammas themselves are pretty scary. But it's a very uninspired section. No puzzles, the most basic form of backtracking just for the sake of it, and most egregiously, no enemy variety. Enemy variety is a big reason why 2 Remake was so damn good. The ways in which you had to approach different situations depending on which enemies you left alive, and whether or not they'd end up in the same room as a Licker or Mr. X, forcing you to adapt. It all just feels so thoughtless or rushed. So I get through it, struggling a little because I didn't realize I had to pick the battery pack back up after using it, and not knowing about the grenade launcher until the very end. At least I scored another inventory upgrade. Back to the surface, and it's time for the first proper boss fight. First I prep and do the cinematic climb to the top of this demolition site. I do find it funny that they thought to include a save point both at the beginning and end of what amounted to a long cutscene. I started by hiding and taking any opening to shoot the fuel tank, the obvious weak point. It was nice breaking in the grenade launcher, a personal favorite of mine throughout the franchise, and it felt as good as ever here. The fire rain wasn't so bad to deal with as long as I kept my distance, but it sure looked cool. He was fast, but not so fast I couldn't dodge out of his range at the last second, and so I quickly found the rhythm to pepper away at him until the tank exploded. He wasn't done yet though, so I started to unload everything I had, but by the end of my handgun rounds, he went down. I heard it said best that Jill has crazy plot armor, and this is a prime example. Shown in protagonist levels of luck, truly. Moving on to another familiar scene, the amount of items here was just what I needed to replenish after the Nemesis fight, so I did some inventory management to fit everything in, only to realize that an item box sat at the back of the store after I finished. I really enjoyed this interaction between Kendo and Jill. He's such a minor character, and yet the difference in attitude to Jill compared to Leon and Ada really paints a vivid picture of who he is, and I love the contrast and how it helps blend the stories together. Key in hand, I made my way through the back alley, destroying another doll and some tentacle zombies on the way. I did not expect Nemesis to be back so soon, much less with his rocket launcher. With some insanely lucky dodges here and there to avoid damage, I made my way back to the main street again. Toy Uncle wasn't taking kindly to all the Charlie dolls I'd been destroying, and with Nemesis's help, gave me a run for my money, but it was easy enough to avoid. Without missing a beat, Nemesis came crashing down, and all I could do was run to where Carlos was waiting at the end of the alley. Love that guy. Then it was time for another cinematic section as everyone patted themselves on the back. With as bad as everyone was faring before now, it is kind of surprising that everyone is still alive. Afterwards, in a surprising twist, I found myself back at the RPD. Seeing Marvin getting bitten by Brad and all the other little details that set the stage for RE2 was awesome. Gameplay-wise, it was pretty alright. New weapons, familiar safe and locker combos, the appearance of an old friend.
It scared the absolute shit out of me.
But it was over pretty quickly. After a bunch of botched fights, I eventually made my way to the STARS office where Dr. Bard made a big impression, and it was back to Jill. There were mine rounds waiting out in the open for me, so of course I used them the first chance I got. Come on, these guys were practically made to be mined. The scenery topside was really quite pretty, and I'm glad I got to enjoy it for a few moments before Nemesis reared his ugly head once again. And boy was it ugly. This new form was actually easier to dodge attacks from, and it gave me ample time to unload my remaining shotgun shells and grenades right into his gobber. But as soon as he started doing zoomies on the rooftops, he managed to land some good shots right back, since I didn't have the tools to hit him from that range. It was a long back and forth battle, and I had to use up a lot of my inventory again, but eventually I triumphed, thanks to the extra shells I found around the arena. After the battle, there were more cutscenes, and with Jill out of commission, it's back to Carlos again. Creepy hospitals will always be a little bit frightening. Having an assault rifle by your side sure does help though. I found the objective pretty quickly, but of course I'd have to find the key in the form of a cassette to pop into this recorder. Plenty of zombies blocked the way, but they were no match for Carlos and the amount of ammunition I'd saved with him. The only thing that could defeat me was myself, and my own ammo-hoarding greed. This is part of the reason I ended up disliking the knife. Like, sure, you can use it to save ammo, like I'd been trying to do, but you don't really need to. Even on hardcore, as you'll see, there's so much that you can practically kill everything as long as you're not missing every other shot, so using the knife just generally puts you in more danger than necessary. But I didn't learn that lesson for a while, so I kept on poking corpses, reading notes, and pushing on through till I dropped back down to the courtyard, where I found the second upgrade to the assault rifle, and the key I needed to get into the locker room back upstairs. And in typical fashion, I was once again jump scared by a locker.
Shit. God damn it.
Nice one, Capcom. After that, and grabbing the ID card, another enemy entered the arena. A new variant of Hunter that I had quite the epic battle with. Considering how tough it was, though, I'd hoped I wouldn't see many more. Which turned out to be unlucky, since the next room I had to go in had 2 of them just sitting there. Thankfully, I'd been sitting on a frag grenade that did an excellent job helping to deal with them, and with that, I finally had my cassette. I was in. Found out that Bard was assassinated, and got Jill's vaccine. And again, Bard wasn't a very prolific character, but the few glimpses we get of him between the cutscenes and notes paint him as a really interesting character. A bit of a bastard, yes, but a very nuanced bastard, and I thought he added a lot to the plot. Same with Tyrell, who I haven't mentioned, but he's a real one. One more Hunter fight later, and it was time to wrap up Carlos' segment with an interesting Horde defense segment. I liked this part. Zombies come in, you shoot them, you win as long as the barrier survives. Even though it lacked a little depth, it was a fun change of pace. I just wish there were more weapons to use, because the assault rifle is really good at killing zombies, and it wasn't all that challenging since there's so much ammo strewn about the room. At a point, the lights go out, and a Hunter charges in, and if there was a bit more chaos like that, this would have been a lot more memorable. It was here that I found the Hunter had an insta-kill attack, and I had to redo it, so that kinda sucked. Funnily enough, this is also the point that you get the final hit pouch for Carlos, and you get to enjoy all that space for about a whole minute before you never touch Carlos again. It kinda makes me wonder if there was more content planned for him that didn't make it into the game. Ah well. Towards the end, a couple tentacle zombies spawn, but they're not too much of a match for the assault rifle either, and the finale is a 30-second holdout while a detonator goes off to block the entrance off for good. After that, it's back to Jill again to finish out the game. Armed with a new burst fire pistol, I got to work re-clearing the hospital to open up all the lockpicking locks that I'd seen. Jill was much better equipped to take out the Hunters with the shotgun and grenade launcher, so it wasn't too long before I grabbed everything I wanted. There was Magnum ammo, alongside shotgun shells and grenades, and most importantly, the Magnum itself, hidden behind a crawl space that Carlos was too big to fit through. With that, I could finally toss my lockpicks and head into the underground warehouse. This started with a long walk, very atmospheric, and I love the attention to detail they put into these environments. Even without enemies, it's sometimes fun to take in the calm before the storm. I picked up Jill's final hit pouch in the safe room here and got ready to thwart Nikolai's plans once and for all. As soon as I replaced the fuses, that is. The warehouse introduces Paleheads to the equation, a familiar enemy to anyone who played the bonus content of the RE2 remake. Essentially, they're just really durable and erratic zombies that have regenerative properties. I quickly found out that they're stronger in this version, since a shotgun blast to the face did absolutely nothing. Besides that, this section is a fun little romp through a fairly linear area to get the 3 fuses to turn the elevator back on. The enemy variety here is better than nearly anywhere else in the game, which is kinda sad to think about, but it was nice seeing dogs in the Hunter Gamma again. But for real, fuck these tentacle zombies. How'd they even get down here without Nemesis showing up? After the fuses, Tyrell came waltzing in, only to get unceremoniously gouged seconds later by old Nemi. That left us in the final area, Nest 2, which feels like a suitably lazy name. The goal here is to obtain a sample of the vaccine to convince the government to not obliterate Raccoon City. Okay, noble goal, but from everything we've seen up till now, I kinda think that maybe we should just nuke the place. Between the tyrants, Nemesis, and the 100,000 or so zombies and other abominations roaming the place, do we really want to risk it? Yeah? Alright, just checking. The section starts out pretty tame with a few zombies to kill and a couple key items to grab. There are quite a few Paleheads past the first unlockable door, but whipping out the Magnum makes short work of them. The final Charlie doll I find in this run is right behind where I pick up the first half of the vaccine. This lab is also littered with notes. I think about half my total playtime in this section was spent picking up and reading them. Besides that, there were a ton of powerful items to collect, and I quickly ended up full on inventory space. After a little scuffle and Jill finally learning Nemesis' name, the vaccine was complete, and on the walk back, the only tough fight of the section happened against a group of hunters. It was really obvious though, so I was already prepared to dump some grenades on them. I'm just glad the tyrants weren't the ones to jump out of the glass. Finally, I stopped by the safe room to mix all the rest of my high-grade gunpowder into Magnum rounds, just because I felt like I'd been neglecting it. Mixing the vaccine required the completion of one of the very few puzzles in the game, and while it was trivially easy, I do wish there were more of these. I've seen this as another pain point for fans of the original. There were many more puzzles, and while some were a bit convoluted, they were fun for what they were and helped to add some variety to the gameplay. With perfect timing, Nemesis had found me once again, and after another overly cinematic sequence, I was in a safe room with enough items to let me know a boss fight was imminent. Nikolai gave his villain monologue, and sure enough, the third fight against Nemesis commenced. I had so much ammo at this point that I had no hesitation ripping into him with grenades and the Magnum, and that phased him real quick. Carlos joined the fray, and his callouts to where Nemesis was hiding were much appreciated, since the zombies crawling in do prove to be a formidable distraction. A bit more struggling, and the fight ends with Carlos coming in big with the crane. He's a very practical protagonist, and that's refreshing to see from a horror game. Nikolai is within our sights, and we're oh so close to snagging back the vaccine he'd taken when the most relentless stalker shows up one last time for an encore. The final fight is more of a gimmick fight, on standard at least, and revolves around blasting Nemesis with this massive railgun. The first shot is free, but the second requires the power cells to be reloaded, so I use my big iron to pump the pustules all over his body and stun him. Unfortunately, I was a bit slow on everything, and let him recover, and that led to my death, as I didn't realize he'd always bonk me if I tried to push them in without dropping him first. On the second attempt, I brought all my full heals, and knowing the fight a bit better, ran him over. One long jog, and a single bullet later, and my first playthrough was concluded. Ever notice that almost all the Resident Evil games end with us riding off into the sunset? So, what were my first impressions? I had a lot of fun. Sure, it was easy to see some of the criticisms, even in this first playthrough, but there were a lot of strong parts. The audio was mostly on point, equally stressful and atmospheric, though sometimes it went a little too hard for my liking. The characters and world building were some of the best in the series so far, with most of the minor characters having a lot more nuance than they had any right to. The enemy and environmental designs were on point as always. My only complaint in this regard is that it felt like there were a lot of reused locations from 2. Most importantly, all of the guns were satisfying to use. But even with all that, a 5.5 hour clear time on my first go was short, and if I'd purchased this game at full price for a single playthrough, I would definitely be disappointed. Thankfully, I picked it up on sale, and doing multiple playthroughs definitely helps me feel like I've gotten my money's worth. I've seen this sentiment echoed since, but the way I describe it then was that it feels closer to DLC for RE2 than it does to being its own complete game. I only say that though because it does a great job expanding on the events that occurred in 2, which makes sense considering their stories intertwine. According to the devs, a lot of what was cut from the original was done so to make a more focused story, and I think they achieved that. However, that came at the cost of gameplay. That signature Resident Evil formula was missed. Sure, we go back to the main street like 3 times, but really there's very little to do, and that's the most revisited section in the game. Each area felt more like running a lap than slowly exploring it all. The lack of puzzles was disappointing, and quick-time events in a game like this are so grossly out of place that it makes me upset. How am I supposed to be scared when all I have to do is push W? Rating it at this point, I gave it a 7 out of 10, and I'm a fairly harsh critic in my opinion. For fans of the series, especially on sale or if you're a big fan of RE2 Remake, I'd easily recommend it, but it's far from a perfect game. However, this was not the end, and things only got worse from here. As I moved into my second playthrough and beyond, the long intro and scripted sequences would really start to wear on me. On top of that, starting on standard had guaranteed I'd need at least 3 more entire playthroughs to finish completing the game. Not wanting to waste too much time, I took the path of least resistance. You see, unlocking achievements or other records according to this menu awards points which can be spent in the shop. There's a ton of overpowered stuff in here. Extra stats, early unlocks, more inventory space, easier dodges, and most notably, infinite ammo weapons. Off the back of that first run, I just so happened to have barely enough points to purchase the infinite ammo MUP, a handgun of moderate power. With it in hand, it was time for hardcore. I won't bore you with all the details again, just the notable parts, as hardcore is much the same as standard, but with a bit less ammo and slightly stronger enemies, and the ammo situation meant a lot less since I had infinite. I went as fast as I could through the intro and timed it out to be about 8 minutes long. Yuck. I tested out my new gun on the first enemy, and yeah, it was actually way better than the infinite pistol from 2. I made my way through the city in much the same fashion I did the first time, grabbing the hose and finding a Charlie doll I'd missed. The substation still freaked me out, but it was pretty easy with infinite ammo. During the first encounter with Nemesis, I'd found I'd gotten much better at perfect dodging somewhere along the way. Maybe it's just because he's got such predictable, big, meaty fists. Unfortunately, I couldn't dodge my own stupidity, and I died a couple times to the zombies I forgot to look at. The damage increase was noticeable, especially for Nemesis. I realized that I could kill the zombies giving me trouble if I shot them at a distance before an enemy jumped down, and I made it to the donut shop to make a checkpoint. That led to me finding out he could in fact come in and camp me at the door, which culminated in an obscenely close call. Subway rerouted and shotgun acquired, I went to finish looting this area and stumbled upon the password to the upstairs safe in the pharmacy, so I went to grab the handgun dot sight, which I didn't end up using at all since infinite ammo. Then it was a mad dash back to the metro that I barely made. I grabbed the jewel goodies, outran Nemesis one more time, and I was already back in the sewers. Knowing what to do made this section fly by. I ran straight to the grenade launcher, and the flame rounds made the game as insanely easy. About 10 minutes later, I was fighting Nemesis on the roof again. He does a lot of damage on hardcore. Bad timing on my end led to a few deaths, but once I was able to do enough damage to explode his tank, a frag and a few extra shots finished him off almost instantly. Frag grenades in this game are busted, and I really underutilized them in hindsight. I continued on, abusing the infinite ammo to glide through to the next Nemesis section. Interestingly, Nemesis seemed much more aggressive with the rockets than he had in the previous playthrough, and I had some close calls. What really caught me off guard though is the giant head rolling a whole hell of a lot faster. I was crushed an embarrassing number of times before I finally realized I could dodge faster downstairs than I could run. Playing as Carlos again, I made much more liberal use of my assault rifle this time around. I realized last playthrough that he gets a tremendous amount of ammo anyway, so I might as well not be stingy. Besides that, nothing of note, and it was another quick done and dusted section. I quickly got into the next Nemesis fight, using the mine rounds to knock him off walls, and more or less knowing where to stand and how to dodge made this fight a lot easier than the first time around too. I do think it's funny that mine rounds seem to work best by just firing them into his face, and alongside a healthy dose of shotgun and pistol, he went down without much trouble. The infinite pistol made Carlos' time in the hospital a breeze, since most of the enemies were only slow-moving zombies. I point back to the enemy variety argument. I did crack and look up the safe combo here. Not knowing was driving me crazy, and it was the last one I needed to get the Master of Unlocking achievement. Worth it. Plus this attachment is crazy good for helping with the hunters, which were the sole purpose my assault rifle served up until the defense segment. Even on hardcore, it was pretty easy with the help of some frag grenades thrown at the right time. Somehow, the 2-for-1 deal achievement also popped here, so I'll take it. And then I finished the game out with Jill. You probably see the pattern here. There's not a lot of difference at all, and besides some optimizations, this run was nearly identical to the previous one. Like, yeah, I learned a good deal about going through the run faster, which would help get that elusive S rank, but the next hurdle is nightmare difficulty, and a bunch of enemy and item spawns are very different. Essentially, this was a bit of a wasted run, and while I'm not super upset with how I approached it, there are 5 difficulty choices by the end of unlocking everything, and this superfluous run proves that it's too much. And you know what? I ended up doing my next run on assisted to knock out a couple of other achievements, and that sucked. By the end of this completion, I did a playthrough on every single difficulty once and will confidently tell you that at least 2 of them ought not to have been in the game. Here's my reasoning. Assisted is good for people who just want the story. It's genuinely easy, but easy can be fun in its own way, and accessibility is important. Standard or hardcore are so similar that they might as well be the same thing compared to the 2 harder difficulties, so just find a sweet spot in the middle and keep one. I personally would lean more towards hardcore, because the amount of ammo you can stockpile is kind of insane, and a bit of extra knowledge about which ammo type to use can trivialize almost every enemy in the game. And the 2 final difficulties are Nightmare and Inferno. Inferno is masochistic levels of pain. I'd keep Nightmare as a challenge mode, and scrap Inferno because my god. And I know there are people who enjoy the pain, but I feel like if you removed it, nobody would miss it. I'll get to that more in a bit. First, I ended my hardcore run with a B, and basically nothing else exciting happened. I had so many magnum rounds by the end that I basically just blew the lab and Nemesis away with it. What was really interesting was that I was beginning to get close to a few of the weapon challenges, and those awarded massive shot points. I had to do a no item box and no healing achievement anyway, so I might as well do a speedrun of assisted and knock those out if I could. My goal was to grab the infinite assault rifle to help run through Nightmare and maybe even Inferno. Now, assisted is kind of funny for these 2 challenges because you get more inventory space and passive healing on top of the enemies being weaker, more plentiful ammo, a free assault rifle for Jill, and aim assist. It went about as well as you'd expect. Not being able to open the item box meant no infinite ammo, but it would have been overkill anyway. The hardest part was managing inventory space. Even with the extra starting slots, it was a lesson in restraint that didn't carry over well from when I did this in the previous games. The rifle and ammo took up 3 slots too, so really I only had 1 extra space without tossing the ammo, and I didn't want to do that. Comboing these 2 challenges together was actually beneficial in that regard because not worrying about healing items freed up a lot of space. Still, by the time I picked up the lockpick, my inventory was already full to bursting. You also do get one heal, technically, but that's supposed to be for removing the parasitized condition when you get it as part of the power substation cutscene. I tried not healing it for a second, but yeah, this would be impossible. I found Nemesis wasn't nearly as bad without the threat of enemies around, so he didn't give me much trouble this time, which honestly was welcome at this point. I needed a break. I kind of felt like picking up the shotgun was a mistake since it again took up extra inventory space, but I suppose if I was going to want any other single weapon, it'd be the shotgun. But then I had to absolutely make sure to use up the bolt cutters so I could discard them and grab the final jewel box for the extra space. I also found out that the frag grenade last playthrough wasn't a fluke, and Nemesis really did have a weakness to them as a single one caused him to drop a box that I hadn't gotten yet, which gave me a new and useful handgun moderator. Adding the grenade launcher to my arsenal made things even more tight, especially with all the different ammo types, but it seemed worth it considering how effective it proved on most tougher enemies. After getting the next expansion though, for some reason, it became considerably easier to manage space. Rooftop Nemesis was decimated by the assault rifle, and I kept trucking along into the police station. Carlos never really struggles with inventory, and that went by like a breeze too. The second Nemesis fight took a bit more, but was still easy. Hospital Carlos went much the same. The hunters on assisted die very fast, so they weren't an issue. By the time I was in the underground warehouse, I was sitting pretty on ammo, and as it goes, the rest of the game was smooth sailing. It was my quickest run yet, at 1 hour and 50 minutes, and I got the 2 achievements I was after and the speedrunner one for under 2 hours. But a bit of a surprise awaited me in the main menu. I was very, very close to unlocking the infinite ammo rocket launcher, and very close to finishing the first milestone for shotgun kills. So like I said, I took the path of least resistance, loaded up one of those assisted saves, and finished it out, bought the rocket launcher, and locked in for Nightmare. I also bought Jill's RE1 outfit, and it looks pretty good. I got through the intro as usual, but when I went to exit the metro, things were immediately different. The Magnum sat right in front of me, as did a hip pouch, which I gladly picked up. The Magnum meant a little less than it otherwise would in this particular instance. Even on this increased difficulty, zombies didn't stand a chance against the overwhelming firepower of the rockets. Picking up anything besides key items and a couple heals felt pretty pointless, so I started to wean myself off the idea that I had to pick up everything. That ended up being the most challenging part of this run, as even Nemesis encounters were a breeze. I'm mixed on my feelings towards this. I do feel like everyone should be able to achieve the unlimited super weapons of these games at some point. I'm just not sure being able to do it early enough to trivialize the hardest difficulties is the right move. I wish they would have just stuck to the tried and true, locking them behind S ranks to encourage mastery of the game instead of grinding, because I did eventually go for all the records, and of course grinding out the weapons was the last one I finished, because there are so many kills to get. It's a bit uninspired, takes too long, and isn't really in the spirit of the games in my opinion. That said, I would not have wanted to do Inferno without it. Nightmare would have definitely been doable. Just like Resident Evil 7's Madhouse difficulty, these last 2 difficulties add in new enemies and switch up the locations of both them and items, which had a tiny touch of that enemy variety that I felt was sorely missing. It's not all that different, but part of me wishes I would have forsaken all the infinite weapons just to see how Nightmare played on its own, because of what I said earlier about too many difficulties. Playing it like this just made it feel like I was doing the extra run for no reason, since I was about to do the same exact run on Inferno afterwards. The absolute hardest part of this run was actually Nemi's final form. I didn't mention this before, but Nemesis got a tiny speed boost in Nightmare. This translated to a massively unfair advantage for him in this fight, and perfect dodging became mandatory to beat him, since one single hit could lead to instant death. I died quite a few times, 15 in fact. A stark reminder that I sucked at dodging. Eventually, I got a lucky streak, and avoided the overhand slap that kept killing me, and finally put him in his place. I earned my first S rank run, and took some time to cool down before Inferno. So, a few things about Inferno. This is the difficulty where they decided to cut down on saves. Before now, auto-saves were plentiful, and even without them, as long as you weren't chasing an S rank, there was a typewriter in every other room. Now there would be no autosaves at all, and less typewriters. No autosaves was scary because that meant I'd have to go through large portions of a much more dangerous game in one attempt. And if you want to know how dangerous... Yep, that death put fear right back into my soul. Thankfully, being a bit more aware was all I needed before I was able to reacquire my trusty rocket launcher. I could also pick up the defense coins and the combat manual I'd purchased to boost my defense to beyond one-shot levels. This ended up being way more powerful than I thought it would be, as it took the enemies back down to doing around hardcore level damage, and the dodge was so much easier to time that I barely got hit in the first place. Combined with the rocket launcher, surviving Inferno wasn't nearly as bad as I expected it to be. Dare I say that it was even easier than Nightmare. Like I expected, this was pretty much the same exact run as before, except even more optimized, as I didn't waste as much time picking up stuff I didn't need. The rockets still killed most things in one hit, and now that I knew the new enemy spots, I just pre-fired them when I could. What I didn't expect is Nemesis getting another speed boost. Holy shit, this guy was fast. If I didn't have my rockets, I'm pretty sure he'd be what I'd have to plan my whole run around. This was the one time I was happy he didn't get more screen time. The sewers went by without a hitch, and then I was at the rooftop fight again where I encountered the one thing more deadly than Nemesis: a bug. Somehow I broke him and I had to reload. The sigh of relief I breathed knowing that I'd just spent one of my precious 5 saves here was a big one. On the plus side, I did get to explore the arena and found out I'd been missing out on a few items every run. The second attempt was barely a fight, and he didn't get to move before kissing the ground. It was easy enough dodging him with the rockets, and Carlos's RPD section also went pretty much the same. The next Nemesis fight almost ended before he could do anything, but he did give me a sick wall snipe clip. The hospital was a bit nerve-wracking because of how many enemies try to ambush you, and dying meant redoing a huge chunk, but thankfully none of them gave me too much trouble. I opted to skip backtracking through the hospital as chill since I didn't really need anything else, and went straight to the warehouse where I made quick work of collecting the fuses. The only mildly dangerous enemies were the Hunter Alphas at the very end of the lab section, because if I stunned myself or missed a shot, there was a real chance they could one-shot me, and that would be disastrous, considering I hadn't saved since before Clock Tower Nemesis. Besides that, the lab was quick, and the Hunters did not, in fact, give me trouble. That left the final 2 boss fights, and after my 15 incidents last time around, I made sure I had my last 2 saves for this moment. Nemesis 3 was way easier than I expected. Much like Nemesis 2, he didn't get a chance to move. Nemesis 4, on the other hand, was about what I expected. He was lightning fast, but oddly, I found it easier to dodge, maybe because all that extra speed offset the weird timings, and the survival book made up for the deficit. I died 3 times before finishing him on the 4th attempt. And thus, I'd finished the hardest achievements in the game in an hour and 14 minutes. To my surprise, when I went to check them on Steam, a whopping 7.7% of players had also accomplished an Inferno S rank. That goes to show that while Inferno itself is no joke, being able to cheese it with shop items definitely cuts down on the prestige. And while I'm mostly okay with it, I think it's a bit of a shame that there's no special reward for doing it outside of the artwork you unlock. The art is cool though, I did enjoy looking at it all after unlocking it. I bought the lockpick, bolt cutters, hip pouches, crafting companion, assault coins, and ride den from the shop, and loaded up one more run on assisted to finish out the collectibles I'd missed. I tried to go out of my way to find them more in the earlier runs, but after seeing where some of these things were hidden, I didn't feel nearly as bad looking them up in the end. The Charlie dolls in particular were in some questionable locations. I'm sure that I could have spent the next 50 hours looking and not found the final one. I was also surprised to see the final note location I'd been missing was right in front of my face at the very end of the game, and I'd somehow managed to run by it 5 whole times without looking down. As for the ride in, it was fun, but a bit slow to use, so I didn't regret not picking it up earlier. I also decided I would focus on the last weapon challenges just to say I did in fact get everything unlockable, and the assault coins really helped stretch the ammo to its limit. Besides that, while gathering the collectibles, I made a couple saves in the spots where I thought it'd be easiest to farm a few kills and then reload them for each weapon. The Carlos wave defense for the assault rifle, and the subway tunnels before Nemesis 2 for the grenade launcher, and killing the paleheads in the lab for the magnum. I almost considered using the big zombie horde in the warehouse instead, but I felt like waiting for the elevators and running there would slow it down a bit too much compared to just walking down the hall. And this conundrum just made me wish I got the magnum earlier in the game. Oh well. Another interesting tidbit I found while farming kills as Carlos was that if you don't place the detonator, the zombies keep spawning endlessly, and if you let it go long enough, they'll start to spawn in as tentacle zombies more and more frequently. Maybe that's anecdotal, but it did get slightly harder the longer time went on. Until it didn't. Turns out their spawns aren't endless after all, and eventually the background guys just kinda hang out while nothing else comes in. Makes me wonder if it'd be any different on Nightmare or Inferno difficulty. So yeah, after finishing the kills, 100% was done. And it wasn't as bad as I expected. I thought Inferno was going to be crazy. I thought the game itself was going to suck. I thought Nemesis wasn't going to be scary. But all of that turned out to be untrue. Some of it for the wrong reasons, sure, but overall this game was fun. So besides it being short, where were the criticisms coming from, I wondered. The only satisfying way to get those answers was to go to the source, and so I played the original for the first time. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it, but I did finish one playthrough, and while making this video, watched a few more. That game and this game are roughly the same length. The difference is that in the old game, you spend more time looking at doors opening and solving puzzles, compared to the QuickTime events and cutscenes of the modern one. But for every area that was missing from the original, there was something else to make up for it in the remake. Some people have complained they missed the puzzles in the remake. I agree. It's just as I've said in the RE2 remake video, they're fun, unobtrusive, and serve as a nice break from the action, so if there were more of them in this remake, it would have been appreciated. Nemesis was also much more present in the original, and that complaint is justified. Like, he's there in the remake just as much, but he's there through cutscenes and boss fights, and I just wish his presence wasn't so theatrical. If he was more of a constant threat, I think he'd still be the most respected Resident Evil enemy, but he has the same issue Jack Baker did in 7. He's the best part of the game, and gone too soon. I also saw complaints about the decision-making sections missing, and to be honest, they didn't really add much to the original. Now, if they took that and really leaned into it in the remake, maybe adding new sections or elements depending on what you picked, then I think that would have been awesome. There's a lack of variety in this game that the original solved with randomness and interconnectedness, and I think that would have fixed it. But the main thing I wanted to say is that I don't actually think the original holds up that well to modern standards. There were a lot of things that I did like about it, considering I'd never played any classic Resident Evils. But the tank controls and the janky aiming just didn't age well. If you had experience playing them in the past and you don't agree, think back to how you felt learning them for the first time. Consider if you'd feel the same way having never touched them before after playing these new iterations, much less other games with insane movement like Dying Light, Dark Souls, or any modern shooter. That said, there was a lot the original did do better. Like I said, it felt more cohesive. It had the mercenaries, and I think the difficulty was tighter and more refined. The art and audio were super atmospheric, and I do think the replayability is better, though I didn't test that part for myself. So, in conclusion, both games have their merits, and I don't think either one is necessarily better than the other, but if I were to recommend one today, I'd recommend the remake. It does a better job telling the story, the characters are fantastic for what they are, that first playthrough is plenty spooky, and for completionists like myself, it's very doable, and it helps fill in the shortness gap. Most importantly, it's fun. I'll never get tired of critical headshotting zombies. The boss fights are pretty solid, the weapons feel good to use, and learning the game still feels rewarding. But the cinematic story does unfortunately introduce tedious sections like the intro, which suck on replays. The enemy variety was fine, but I wanted to see more of them overlap, though this is something the original didn't do well either. Nemesis could have and should have been more of an omnipresent threat. The collectibles, besides the weapon parts, sucked as usual. I do wish I would have been more challenged and more rewarded with getting the hardest achievements. I don't mind the use of infinite ammo weapons to help with getting something like Inferno, but getting an infinite ammo rocket launcher before even Nightmare is wild. I wish Carlos and his sections were expanded on just a little more. Like I said, getting the hip pouch at the very end of his final segment made me think they cut something. And I do genuinely wish there were more puzzles. Value aside, I gave my first playthrough a 7 out of 10, and after having finished everything, I'd give it a 6.5 out of 10. It's a good, fun sequel that's worth playing for basically anyone who enjoyed RE2 Remake, or any of the other games in the franchise maybe, but probably not worth playing without that experience. So with that said, it might surprise you to hear that I'm going to give it an A on my completion tier list, just the same as Resident Evil 2. And that's because I am a fan of these games. I do think completing it added to my enjoyment quite a bit, and if nothing else, it was a straightforward 20-hour grind. I think it's fair to be critical, but it's also one of those moments where I'm glad I didn't listen to the detractors for once, because it's a game that's more fun than the sum of its parts. There's an important lesson in there about forming your own opinions, but that can be for another day. For now, I just picked up Resident Evil 4, and I'm really looking forward to that since the original was my first Resident Evil back in the day. So, thanks for watching this long. I'm out. See ya.